I'm 73. At 14, I shut a letter that might have saved my mother. In the next 45 seconds, you'll get the one boundary sentence I wish I'd said out loud. No gore, no theatrics. I'll let the door frame, the kitchen knife, and my father's watch do the talking. If you've ever smiled so a room would stay calm while your stomach whispered, "Don't," you're already in my kitchen with me. If you've ever kept quiet to keep the peace, you know this story's first move. Polite silence that buys a quiet minute and sells tomorrow. Start with the light. Tea, too much milk. The kettle clicks off, a neat little verdict. A radio in the next room mumbles a chorus about patience and rain. On the table, a half-open letter with a softened edge where my thumb kept hesitating. I tell myself I'll finish it after the dishes. Peace seems cheaper than truth. Dad has brought home a boy who looks like a second chance. We hand him a spare key, a sea-green room, and our best manners. Then tiny losses, a bracelet, a laugh, my mother's ease. I notice and say nothing. Kindness is a lovely coat. Fear wears it beautifully. Here's the promise and the tool. Before this minute ends, I'll give you the exact sentence a 14-year-old can use to set a boundary without a fight. You can say it tonight, in your kitchen, on your commute, wherever you're holding your breath right now. I'm telling this straight. No images you can't unsee. We'll listen instead. To the clock getting louder, to breath that can't find its rhythm, to a letter waiting like a question no one wants to answer. I press the envelope closed with one fingertip, tell myself I'll read the last line later. The front door clicks. Before anything bent, our house ran on small rituals that felt indestructible. Sundays smelled like orange peel and laundry soap. Dad's uniform hung from the bedroom door like a steady idea. Mom's lesson plans lived in a neat stack under the radio. If you'd walked in then, you would have called it ordinary and meant it as praise. Mornings started with mercy disguised as hot water. The kettle clicked, hissed, and made the kitchen a little chapel. Mom liked the counters wiped so clean you could see the shadow of your hand before you touched them. I liked the way the floor tiles held a day's worth of footprints. Proof we lived here, proof we made it back each evening. The garden out back was small but bossy. Lime and orange and guava trees nudging each other like siblings who refused to give an inch. When the wind came through, the leaves sounded like a crowd trying not to applaud. Dad believed in clocks. He didn't worship time, he partnered with it. His watch ticked low and polite, never scolding, always certain. He used it to fold our life into pockets. 5 minutes for shoes, 10 for the bus, 20 for the market. The watch made promises and kept them, and I didn't know yet how rare that was. If the bus rumbled past at 7:12, the world was fine. If the radio read the weather at the top of the hour, the world was fine. If Dad's watch kept steady time while he sipped coffee black as a secret, the world was fine. Mom's classroom voice came home with her, softer but still shaped like a gentle command. She'd say, "Let's make dinner," and it felt like being invited to a team that always won. She taught literature, which meant our house was full of people who never existed. Some nights they argued with each other across the kitchen, Odysseus being scolded by a Bronte sister while the rice simmered. Mom could make almost anything sound noble, even chores. When she said, "Would you set the table?" I set it like a stage. I was 14 and busy pretending that childhood and adulthood were two rooms I could cleanly step between. I kept a notebook under my mattress where I wrote down everything I believed would still be true in 10 years. The list had 13 items. Number 1, a kind person is always safe to love. Number 3, homes remember. Number 7, if you do the right thing will happen. I didn't cross anything out for a long time. We had neighbors who behaved like punctuation, appearing at useful moments, giving the day shape. Senora Julia from next door brought over tamales and gossip that was mostly kindness in costume. The couple upstairs argued with their windows open, then laughed so loudly the building forgave them. The building forgave everybody. It had seen worse. The paint on the stair rail knew a century of hands. On school days, I moved through the city like a bead on a string. Bus, corridor, desk, bell, home. Nothing significant, which was the significance. When you're 14, ordinary is a currency you don't know you're spending until you're broke. I spent it freely. Long showers, loitering at the market stalls, the luxury of reading the back of a cereal box twice. Dad's job meant the occasional late night. He was a good man in a uniform that promised help but sometimes delivered paperwork. When he spoke about work, he used a voice that handled words like fragile boxes. Don't drop, don't shake. He said the world could be sharp, so we kept our home soft. I believed him. I still think softness is a kind of strategy, the kind that doesn't get credit until it's gone. Sound carried through our apartment like a subtle weather report. From the kitchen, radio whispers and spoon against cup. From the hallway, the zipper of Dad's jacket and the squeak of polished boots. From our bedroom, paper sighing under a pencil, the thrum of a fan that never quite cooled the whole room. These were not just sounds, they were a map, the kind you follow back when you've been somewhere you wish you hadn't. Sundays were the crown. We did not hurry. Dad peeled oranges with the patience of a surgeon and left the rind in one perfect coil. A bright question mark on the cutting board. Mom read the paper and hummed without lyrics. Sometimes she braided my hair, which felt like having my thoughts put into order. She would ask what I wanted from the week, and I would say something huge and silly, like a miracle, and she would nod as if I had asked for salt. We set the table like an altar, plates, forks, napkins folded without fuss, the good glasses that clicked cheerful when water met them. Our cat, Romeo, patrolled the house as if he'd been elected. He checked the windows, checked the sunbeams, checked the top of the fridge for threats and crumbs. If you've ever loved a small animal that thinks it's a security guard, you understand how he made us laugh even when nothing was funny. He slept on the back of the sofa in a shape that looked like punctuation 2. Comma, semicolon, nap. This is what fine looked like. It wasn't perfect. We ran out of money sometimes. The roof leaked like it had opinions. I fought with friends, then reconciled dramatically because being 14 is theater school you didn't know you enrolled in. But the spine held. The spine was, we come home, we eat together, we tell the truth that fits in the room. If I look back with unkind eyes, I can find the hairline cracks. The way Mom would pause mid-sentence some evenings, listening to nothing, then smile like she'd remembered her place in the script. The way Dad sometimes polished his watch with the edge of his shirt for a beat too long. The way Romeo avoided the guest room even when the sun landed there like a blessing. But at the time, those were crumbs I vacuumed with the rest. Ordinary is excellent camouflage. I'm telling you this not to make the fall harder, but to be precise. People like to say everything changed overnight, and sometimes it does. More often, the night in question is just the first one where you finally notice what the house has been trying to tell you. Our house spoke in citrus and static and steady ticking. It spoke in plans and lists and the fairness of shared chores. It spoke in the low kindness of people who had seen sharp things and chose to be round anyway. If you had come by on the afternoon before the letter, if you'd stood in our doorway and sniffed the air for trouble, you would have smelled oranges and soap and a story that thought it knew its ending. You would have said, "What a lovely ordinary home." And I would have said, "Exactly." The afternoon Dad brought him home, the air was warm and sticky. The kind that makes curtains cling to your wrist when you brush past them. Dad stood in the doorway with a boy my age plus 2 years, maybe 3. He had careful shoulders, like he'd learned to make himself smaller than his shadow. He carried nothing but a plastic bag and a thank you that barely cleared his throat. "Just for lunch," Dad said, and tilted his watch as if that could turn this into less than it already was. Mom's smile went on like a porch light, automatic, steady, the kind neighbors trust. Mine followed because that's what faces in our house did. We made space at the table without talking about making space. Mom set another plate, another glass. The boy sat on the edge of his chair like a temporary idea. He said his name softly, as if names were something you could bruise. I won't repeat it here. What matters for now is the way his hands trembled around the water glass, then went still when he focused. A person who can freeze their own nerves on command learns it somewhere. Lunch did what lunches do, turned strangers into people who pass the salt. We talked about weather, buses, the bakery that sometimes forgot to charge for a second roll. He smiled, almost apologetically, at every kindness thrown his way, as if each one might be the last. When Mom offered seconds, he hesitated like generosity might be a trick question. He said thank you in a way that made you want to keep offering things. After he left, the house kept a version of him. A smell of laundry soap, a folded napkin no one claimed. Dad said, "He needs a few nights, just until paperwork." Mom nodded. I watched the nod land in her shoulders. That night, we ate oranges and planned a welcome that pretended not to be one. The spare room had been a museum of almosts, boxes, an extra fan, books that refused to be given away. We emptied it like we were being graded. The walls were a tired beige, the kind that looks like it gave up mid-sentence. We bought paint the color of sea glass. Mom said, "Green soothes." I said, "Green forgives." We both laughed because neither of us knew yet what needed soothing or forgiving. Painting is a kind of prayer. Long stretches of quiet motion where your mind wanders around the edges of a decision. We cut in the corners, rolled the big panels, left a thumbprint of new color on the door where a person would touch without thinking. I opened the window and the air moved through the room like a polite guest. Romeo stationed himself in the hallway and judged the proceedings, tail twitching like a metronome. We added a bedspread with a small pattern, so it would look busy enough to feel lived in. Mom set a glass on the nightstand and tucked a clean hand towel beneath it, a habit she'd learned from her mother. I wrote a note that said welcome and slipped it under the glass so the word would ripple if the water shifted. It was a child's magic trick, but I believed in it. On his second day, the boy arrived with a more solid thank you and a cardboard box that had been a fruit crate in a previous life. Inside, 3 shirts, a paperback novel swollen from rain, a photo of nobody smiling. He looked at the room as if we'd built him a stage and handed him a script he wasn't sure he could read. Mom showed him where we kept towels. Dad showed him where the fuse box lived, because Dad believed that knowing a fuse box was a kind of citizenship. I showed him the best spot in the garden, where the sun pretended to be generous even when it wasn't. We baked a cake because ceremony matters. Not a big one, just a round pan and frosting the color of optimism. Mom piped, "Welcome" in careful letters, then leaned the knife against the bowl the way she always did, like a flag at rest. The radio filled the kitchen with a song about starting over. The singer sounded both convinced and exhausted. We ate cake standing up because sitting felt too formal for a person who might still need to leave quickly. He laughed at something small, I said, the laugh landing late, like a train that stopped at a station it hadn't planned to visit. The first night he slept anyway. You could hear it from the hallway, the breathing that belongs to someone trying not to dream. I passed the doorway with a glass of water like an offering to the god of better beginnings. Romeo sniffed the threshold, considered crossing it, then arranged himself on the floor outside, sphinx-like, as if guarding something unnameable. In the morning, the house did what houses do with new weight inside them. It recalibrated. The kettle took a second longer to boil. The bathroom mirror fogged in a different pattern. The bus sounded louder, as if it had been told to announce itself. Little proofs of a life multiplied. The extra cup in the drying rack, the second towel damp on the hook, the new toothbrush trying not to look like an intruder. Dad placed a spare key on the kitchen table. The key made a sound, a tidy metal clink, that felt like a line being drawn with a ruler. "So you don't get locked out," he said, as if life were a series of doors that behaved. The boy took the key like you take a live thing that might bite. He put it in his pocket and patted it once, not to check it was there, but to confirm it would stay. We taught him our map. Buses, corner stores, which doorman pretended not to notice kids sneaking in an extra friend, which block got mean after dark. He learned quickly, the way you do when learning is cheaper than making a mistake. He called Mom, ma'am, and Dad, sir, and me by my name like it might vanish if he said it wrong. For a week, the house wore Hope like a new coat that fit well enough to keep. Hope made things brighter. The paint seemed bluer. Breakfast tasted like a decision we could keep making. Mom set aside a portion at dinner without being asked. Dad adjusted his watch band one notch tighter, the way he did when he wanted to feel the pulse of time. If you need the story to be simple, it could end here. Second chances, sea green walls, a key that opens the right doors. But lives resist tidy endings. They prefer overlapping circles, useful details that turn out to be warnings, kindness that turns out to be lighter than it looks when weather comes. There were small tells I didn't name because naming is a kind of commitment. The way he flinched when a glass tapped the counter. The way he studied the map on the fridge as if streets might rearrange themselves overnight. The way Romeo avoided his ankles like they told a story he couldn't read. I filed those thoughts in a quiet cabinet labeled, "Not Today." The afternoon Dad said, "He'll be with us a while." Mom nodded. The nod looked the same, but landed deeper. We bought a second laundry basket. I wrote, "Welcome again," this time on a piece of tape wrapped around a charger cord because sometimes hospitality is electricity. When you invite a person into your house, you also invite whatever taught them to be that person. Most of the time, it's fine. Someone else's music in your hallway, someone else's way of rinsing plates. Sometimes, though, an invisible guest arrives and sits where you can't see them. We felt something take a seat at the table. We smiled harder. On the night that closes this chapter, the radio hummed a sweet nothing. The paint dried into its final color. The spare key learned which pocket it belonged to. I lay in bed and made a new list of things that would still be true in 10 years. I added one. A house gets bigger when it makes room. I didn't cross anything out. The first red flag wasn't a scream. It was a missing spoon. Mom kept the cutlery like a small orchestra, each piece in its slot polished enough to throw back the morning. One Tuesday, a soup spoon disappeared. Not a tragedy, not a headline, just a silence where silver should be. Mom blinked at the drawer, laughed at herself, and moved on. I didn't. The drawer closed a little harder than usual, a punctuation mark that didn't match the sentence. Then the cat bowl. Romeo was a punctual animal. He treated meal times like contracts. One evening his bowl sat immaculate, the kibble still pyramid perfect. He stared at the hallway as if the hallway owed him an apology. When I called, he came, but he ate with the disinterest of an actor delivering lines from the wrong play. He slept on the floor outside the spare room, not his favorite place. Too much tile, not enough sun. I told myself cats are mysterious because it's cute when we don't understand something. I started cataloging the small offs. The sea green door to the spare room left just a thumb's width open when it used to settle flush. A glass on the nightstand with fingerprints that didn't match the pattern Mom and I made when we cleaned. The fuse box panel ajar, like someone had asked a question and forgotten to close it. Nothing you couldn't explain with generosity. Everything you could explain if you wanted to keep the day simple. Mom misplaced her bracelet, the thin gold one Dad gave her the year I turned 10. She checked the dish on her dresser, then the bathroom shelf, then the pocket of the jacket she only wore when the weather was undecided. "I'll find it," she said, adopting the tone you use for a student who's about to cry. She smoothed the bedspread. The pillow on her side had a dent that didn't look like her. I smoothed it too, like that could put the day back together. He learned our house quickly, too quickly in ways I admired because admiration is a forgiving habit. He knew which floorboard near the kitchen squeaked and how to step over it. He knew the rhythm of our evenings. Radio at 7, kettle at 8, dishes at 8:30 if we didn't talk too long. He learned the light switches like they were a language he already spoke. He thanked Mom for laundry in a voice that sounded practiced but sincere, a choir of good intentions. When he laughed, it arrived late, as if laughter were an airport where his flights kept circling. When he sat at the table, his hands arranged themselves like he'd studied other people's hands. Once I found him standing in the hallway with his palms pressed to the wall, like he was listening through it. He said he had a headache. I fetched water. The glass trembled slightly against his mouth and made a music that didn't belong to glasses. Dad's watch began to sound louder to me, a new drum line beneath the ordinary. He didn't change anything, same band, same habit of wiping the face with the edge of his shirt, but I could hear it now in rooms where I'd never heard it before. Once, while folding towels, I caught myself counting ticks between breaths. I lost the game when the towel snagged on a nail and the sound of fabric tearing felt too much like an omen. Red flags often wear beige. They pass as background. The way the spare key migrated from the hook to his pocket and then didn't leave. The way the radio station changed to static and stayed there for hours as if static were a choice. The way Dad started checking windows twice before bed. He said it was habit. He said it was work. He said it like the truth, and a rehearsal can share a costume. I tried out sentences in my head, and none of them fit in my mouth. "Mom, have you noticed?" Sounded like a betrayal of hospitality. "Dad, something's off." Sounded like I didn't trust the system he lived inside. So I did the softer thing. Made more tea, set the table early, left the hallway light on as if kindness could spill under doors. Mom's smile thinned at the edges. Not always, not enough to sight. But sometimes, after washing a single plate, she'd dry her hands like she was wiping away a thought. She started keeping her lesson plans on a higher shelf. "So I don't lose them," she joked, though she never lost them. Romeo began sleeping on my bed, a promotion he hadn't requested. He woke at sounds I didn't hear and settled before I could ask what he imagined. One afternoon, I came home to find the sea-green door closed and the window in that room open. A cuff of curtain breathed in and out like it had a small, private grief. The bedspread had a new crease that ran from pillow to footboard. Single, straight, careful. On the nightstand, the glass sat on the towel Mom had tucked beneath it on the first day. The towel was damp. The glass was exactly where it should be. My throat felt exactly where it shouldn't. I left a note on the fridge. "Dinner at 7?" The pen left a groove like a path I'd walk again and again. I could have written more. I could have asked a question. I could have told on my own doubt. Instead, I stacked plates, wiped a counter that wasn't dirty, and listened to the hallway rehearse being harmless. That evening, he told us a story about school that was funny enough to keep. We laughed in the right places. He smiled in the right shape. Dad's watch kept time like it believed in us. Mom reached for the drawer to set the table and paused. A tiny pause. The kind only people who love you for years can read. She looked at me. I looked at the spoon-shaped space and then at her. She set the table with forks and didn't mention it. I started waking early to re-meet the house before everyone else did, to see what the rooms looked like when they pretended not to be watched. I found small migrations, a book 2 inches left, a chair angled toward a door like a compass adjusting its mind. I told myself I was being dramatic. 14 is good at drama and bad at evidence. I wanted to be good at being good. A week later, I went to grab a sweater from my parents' room. The door was not locked. It never was. The bed was made like a photograph. The pillow on Mom's side had that dent again, a perfect comma. On the dresser, Dad's watch was not where he left it. It lay 3 inches south, face up, ticking as if it had moved itself to be better heard. The closet smelled faintly like soap that wasn't ours. I stood perfectly still, as if stillness were a test I could pass. I told myself a story. Guests bring new air, new patterns, new ways of placing glass on wood. I told myself another. Good families are generous with space. Then I told myself the one I would come to regret. Boundary talks can wait until everyone is comfortable. On the night before the bracelet reappeared in a place it had never lived, the bottom of the laundry basket beneath a towel no one used, I heard the fuse box click without anyone touching it. I lay in bed counting the seconds between that sound and the next thing. The next thing wasn't a sound. When small wrongs multiply, good families reach for good tools first. We tried courtesy like it was duct tape. We tried distance like it was medicine. We tried harmony like it was a habit we could brute force into working. None of it held. The first fix was politeness plus, the kind that adds please to a boundary and hopes the adverb does the heavy lifting. We adjusted the evening rhythm so we'd collide less. I took homework to my room. Mom prepped dinner earlier. Dad shifted his paperwork to the balcony where the city could steal his attention. Give space, Mom said, as if space were a gift we could afford forever. For a week, the house softened like bread under steam. The radio found its station again. Romeo napped in his usual sunbeam. The spoon went missing a second time. The next fix was structure. Dad loved lists. Lists had never betrayed him. He made a chore chart with tidy boxes and dates, a small calendar of fairness. The boy nodded like a straight-A student and checked off squares before the ink was dry. The kitchen gleamed. The fuse box stayed shut. The sea-green door began to close itself without sound, the kind of silence that asks for more of itself. At dinner, he apologized for being a lot. He said it like a person who knew the script, like the apology had been rehearsed in bathrooms and borrowed rooms across the city. We forgave him, because forgiveness is cheap at first and priceless later. Mom tried hospitality upgraded. She set a plate aside before anyone asked, tucked a clean towel beneath his glass, labeled a shelf with his name so the kitchen could call him by it. He thanked her, eyes shiny without water. "You don't have to," he said, which is what grateful people say when they want you to keep going. She smiled and kept going. That night, her bracelet reappeared at the bottom of the laundry basket, under a towel no one used. "Found it," she said, like a magician revealing a card you'd already given up on. She put it on and twisted it once, the way you test a hinge. I tried friendliness as surveillance. I asked about school in ways that were questions dressed as weather. He offered answers that were weather dressed as answers. We played a board game where you move around a city collecting things. He joked that real life gave you fewer turns. He laughed late again, that delayed arrival that made my skin feel one size too small. When I walked him through our neighborhood map, he traced the streets with a forefinger that shook only when it passed our block. The cat offered data I ignored. Romeo refused the spare room entirely now, like the floor plan had updated without telling us. He slept on my chest some nights, heavy as a verdict, and sprang up at footsteps that never reached our door. Once I found him staring at the fuse box with the intensity he usually reserved for insects. When I called his name, he didn't blink. The box, for that breathless beat, felt like a mouth learning a new word. The third fix was a family meeting, which is what good families do when they want to believe in explanations. We sat at the table with water like it was wine. Dad's watch ticked even and even and even. Mom said, "We are a house that says things out loud." I added, "If something's off, we can adjust." The boy nodded. He said he was grateful. He said he had habits from before and he was working on them. He looked at Dad's watch as if the second hand were a teacher. We agreed on not going into bedrooms without asking, on where keys lived, on which drawers belonged to whom. We all exhaled like we'd signed a peace accord. That week, nothing obvious went wrong, unless you count the way the radio drifted to static at sunset like it had an appointment. The fourth fix was avoidance with better manners. We became experts at timing. I left the kitchen when he entered. He took showers after we went to bed. Mom layered conversation like wallpaper, talk on top of talk until the walls felt warmer. Boundaries existed, but only where you could see them. The unseen ones. Don't borrow a body's ease. Don't stand where a person keeps their breath. Those stayed unspoken because the words felt like a kind of violence we didn't want to commit. Dad tried mentorship, the hard, decent kind. He showed the boy how to change a plug, how to find the load on a circuit, how to listen for the faint buzz that means not today. In the glow of a socket's tiny victory, the boy looked almost light. He said, "Thank you, sir," in a tone that made my ribs hurt. That night, the hallway light burned out early. When Dad unscrewed the bulb, it was warm even though it shouldn't have been. I reached for prayer by proxy, the secular kind. I made small altars out of tidy spaces, a perfectly folded towel, a dish rack with blades turned the same way, a row of shoes like commas. Order is a spell you cast when you don't want to say the spell you need. The house obeyed, as houses do, until it didn't. Our biggest false fix was forced harmony. This is the one where everybody agrees to be okay at the same time. We invited the neighbors over for coffee and laughter on purpose, like we could import safety. It worked. For 2 hours. Stories swelled to fill the room. The boy listened as if learning a dance he didn't intend to perform. When the door closed behind our guests, the apartment shrank back to its true size. The clock sounded louder, as if it had been polite all evening and was done. More tiny losses. A book moved left by 2 inches. A dresser drawer not closed flush. The smell of soap that wasn't ours blooming in a room we kept clean enough to be a question. I told myself teenagers are ecosystems, weather changes. I told myself kitchens keep secrets for the right reasons. I told myself we were tired and kind and good. Mom began to double-check locks and then apologize to the air. "Habit," she'd say, smiling at a doorknob like it might blush. Dad put his watch on the dresser at night and placed his palm over it for a second, as if fixing its time to ours. The boy started humming under his breath, not a tune I knew, just a thread of sound you could trip on if you weren't careful. Romeo learned the art of disappearing from a room without leaving it. The night before everything bent, the countdown that lived inside our ordinary got louder. None of us named it that, but the house did. The kettle clicked off with the finality of a stamped form. The radio settled on static as if choosing a side. The spare key didn't return to its hook. The letter, yes, that letter, found its way to the table again, like a tide delivering the same shell to the same shore. I tried one last fix, a boundary sentence I rehearsed in my head all afternoon. I'm not comfortable with the door closed when Mom's not home. Plain, non-accusatory. A line drawn with a pencil instead of a knife. I found him in the hallway and opened my mouth. "Could we—" I started and stopped. Because Dad stepped through the front door at that exact second with a tired smile and a sack of oranges, and the line retreated to where lines go when you don't draw them. We ate late. Conversation orbited safe planets. The watch kept time. The room held. I put the dishes in the rack blades down because it felt like choosing gentleness. I wiped the counter twice, a superstition I didn't know I had, and turned to the table to move the letter. It had shifted on its own, or maybe I'd shifted without noticing. Either way, the last line still waited. I pressed the envelope shut with a fingertip, not ready to read the part of the day that knew more than I did. Then came the sound a house makes when it decides to stop pretending. The sound came first, a soft decision disguised as a click. Front door. It was early evening, the color the sky wears when it can't commit. The kettle had already done its verdict. The radio had chosen static like a mood. Dad set a sack of oranges on the counter. The fruit rolled and stopped against each other like quiet arguments. Mom's bracelet flashed once in the kitchen light, a small moon trying to matter. The house took a breath I could hear. I had the letter in my hand without remembering reaching for it. Paper has a way of asking for your attention by pretending to be polite. The edge pressed into my thumb the way a promise presses into a day. I didn't open it. Not yet. The envelope was a door I kept refusing to walk through. I caught a movement in the hallway, a shadow folding itself into a person. He stepped into the kitchen with that careful shoulders look, the one that tried to be smaller than whatever the room could hold. "Evening," he said, and the word hit the floor with a soft heel. Dad answered. Mom smiled. I put the letter down. It made a sound like a moth landing. Tiny things chose sides. The clock grew louder. The faucet dripped once. Somewhere upstairs, a neighbor dragged a chair across the floor at the speed of dread. Romeo lifted his head, ears triangulating the air like math. We ate oranges and small talk. The room obeyed its own choreography. Pass a plate, pass a glance, pass a silence. The boy laughed late and touched the spare key in his pocket without realizing his hand had moved. Dad reached for a knife to score the rind. The blade tapped the cutting board, an exact practical sound. He set it down by the bowl the way he always did. A detail filed itself away for later. After dishes, Mom wiped counters as if proof of care could be polished into the laminate. Dad double-checked the windows and said, "Habit," the way you say prayer when you're not sure who's listening. The boy disappeared down the hallway. Footsteps so light you could think he'd learned to walk on the parts of the floor that weren't there. The spare room door clicked almost shut and held its breath. I carried a glass of water and the letter, one in each hand, as if balance were a strategy. The radio tried to settle on a station. A melody showed its face, then vanished. In the half-lit hall, air felt organized, as if someone had made lists in it. The door to my parents' room was ajar. I never found that odd until I did. The details are allowed to speak. The bedspread on my parents' bed sat tight. But the pillows had new geography, a shallow on Mom's side, a second shallow where no one should have rested. Dad's watch lay on the dresser 3 inches south of where he left it, face up, second hand sweeping like a lighthouse on a small coast. The closet door wasn't fully home in its frame. The room smelled faintly like clean soap that didn't belong to us. A window breathed against its latch. I moved toward the door frame like it was a friend I could become. The wood was warm under my palm. You don't think about the temperature of a door frame until a moment writes it down for you. I was about to call out, "Mom?" But the word snagged on a thorn of caution I didn't know I had grown. And then there were footsteps. 2 sets, one too soft, one trying to be heavy. The air felt crowded the way a narrow street does when 2 cars insist on passing. I stepped back into the hall and held the glass and the letter and my own breath like 3 separate, equally fragile objects. Things happened without narration. Dad came down the hall with a voice built to steady other people's voices. Mom followed with a smile that wanted to be real and wasn't certain. The boy stood a shade inside the spare room door, hands loose, eyes tidy, like a person who had alphabetized his feelings. Dad's watching look, the one that worked at work, arrived. It collected details. It didn't like what it collected. "Everyone all right?" he asked, the way a person tests a floor. "Of course," Mom said, and the words were correct but didn't belong in this sentence. The radio, as if irritated by our attempt at normal, surrendered to static again. Romeo's tail flicked once. Punctuation. There are moments that do math on you. The letter in my hand, the watch on the dresser, the almost closed closet, the dent on a pillow that would not hold an honest story, and the knife, just a kitchen tool, still resting where Dad had set it down. I felt the boundary sentence I had rehearsed all day climb back up my throat. I'm not comfortable with the door closed when Mom's not home. It was too late for that exact version. I tried to swap the nouns. I'm not comfortable with... The sentence didn't finish because the room finished before it. What follows belongs to objects and timing. Dad reached, not for anyone. For the truth he believed rooms owed him. The boy stepped, not toward anyone, toward the space between. The hallway turned narrow, then narrower. My hand found the doorframe again and didn't let go. The glass in my other hand cooled into my palm like a warning pretending to be water. There was a scuffle that wasn't a fight yet. There was force that wasn't violence yet. There was a sound like a drawer forgetting which direction it was meant to go. Speech tried to happen and chose not to. The watch on the dresser kept its small, professional time, uninterested in our theater. The kitchen knife, still innocent, waited on wood. I tell this without details you can't return from. Pressure, not pain. Angles, not injuries. A room that refused to be big enough for 3 different needs. Mom said my name the way you say a password. Dad said the boy's name the way you summon someone from the edge of a building. The boy said nothing and everything by where he put his feet. The letter slid from my fingers and skimmed the floor like a white fish in shallow water. That small fall made a sound I still hear sometimes when a page turns. I set the glass down, carefully, because care was the only currency I felt trustworthy with, and stepped toward the kitchen in a line that knew its own plan before I did. The knife was exactly where I expected it. My hand knew its weight because hands learn kitchens before they learn danger. I did not think of movies or of headlines. I thought of the line a body makes when it stands between 2 other bodies. I thought of how doors work. I thought of the physics of a watch, steady motion in a world that refuses to coordinate. When I returned to the hall, the air had become the thin kind, the kind you ration. The boy moved. Dad moved. Mom didn't, which was a movement of its own. I placed myself where the hallway narrowed and held the knife low, not as a threat, but as a fact. Words finally arrived, simple as a road sign. Stop. We're done. My voice sounded like someone else's. Older and very, very sure. Things can end in 3 seconds and also take 10 years. The seconds won. The hallway chose a shape. Dad's hand found mine without taking the knife, a trust I felt in the bones of my fingers. The boy looked at that connection the way a traveler looks at a closing gate. There was a decision. There was another. And the room decided with us. What the law later called self-defense felt at the time like gravity choosing sides. The scene resolved not into triumph, but into aftermath. The watch ticked into the next minute, indifferent to ceremony. The radio finally found a station, someone singing 3 notes that couldn't fix anything. The letter lay open now, the last line visible, a sentence that meant more before than after. We did not celebrate. We sat where we could sit. Dad put the knife on the counter as if returning a book to the library. Mom leaned into a chair back and let the chair hold more than it was designed for. I stood in a doorway and memorized wood grain because that was safer than memorizing faces. A house makes new sounds after a night like that. Pipes rehearse. Floorboards debrief. The refrigerator hums like a tired guardian. The human parts of the story try to become nouns. Report, statement, file. But for a while, you are just a verb, breathing. I picked up the letter and read the last line. It did not save us. It could have warned us. It did both, but only in the tense that comes after. Morning wore yesterday like a bruise it couldn't hide. The hallway smelled faintly of citrus and disinfectant, as if someone had tried to clean a story. The first official object was yellow, tape across the doorway, humming in the small wind like a nervous instrument. A clipboard appeared next, then pens, then questions carrying their own weather. Statements live on paper, but they begin in the throat. An officer with a careful voice asked for the sequence. Sequence sounds simple until you owe it accuracy. Start at the beginning, he said. We tried to decide where that was. The letter? The spoon? The door's small click? Dad sat straight, hands open on the table as if honesty improved with airflow. Mom wrapped her fingers around a mug she didn't drink from. I watched the steam disappear and envied it for having a plan. They bagged the knife like you bag a lightning strike. Gentle, respectful, unwilling to pretend it was just metal. They photographed the watch where it lay, then asked Dad to hold it up so the second hand would show. That felt rude and necessary at the same time. I answered what they asked and nothing they didn't. When language tried to tilt toward drama, I tightened it back to nouns: doorframe, step, voice, stop. The officer nodded in the rhythm of someone balancing empathy with protocol. A different room, a different table, more paper. Rooms like that absorb your words and return them as printouts that look sterile next to your handwriting. Self-defense was the phrase that showed up early, like a responsible adult arriving at the right hour. It doesn't land with relief. It lands with paperwork. I signed where they told me. My name looked like I'd written it underwater. Media is a water that finds any opening. The building gained a perimeter of tripods and microphones with branded flags that looked like tiny countries claiming territory. A reporter tried to make the air agree with a verdict before the people did. "Tragic," she said, warming the word between her palms like a cold bird. Someone else said hero, as if that were a sweater you could throw over a shaking story to make it decent. I stood behind the curtain and watched shapes move. Romeo pressed his body along my shin, anchoring me to the part of the day that was still tactile. News packages love a thesis. Our windows became rectangles on a screen while a voice narrated our kitchen like it was a national park. In this ordinary home. There were diagrams, arrows, a tasteful blur. The hallway lost its smell and gained a graphic. Strangers in comment sections said sentences about us that learned our names by spelling them wrong. People are bolder when the room doesn't require their breath. The case file arrived later like a book whose first chapter we thought we'd written. Inside were other chapters we didn't know existed, notes from other addresses, dates not on our calendar, a history that had taught the boy to hold a teacup with trembling hands and to smile like it might help. None of it excused anything. All of it built a context. Reading it felt like discovering that the storm that hit your street formed over an ocean months ago, far beyond your umbrella's jurisdiction. Dad treated the file like a living thing, never on the floor, never under anything heavier than it. He turned pages gently, as if paper had feelings and we'd already heard enough. When he reached the section that mattered, the one where our hallway and our names appeared, he placed his palm on the table beside it, grounding the page to the wood. He didn't say much. Men who believe in time believe in letting it pass over them until the math of it makes sense. We met a lawyer who wore uncomplicated shoes and sentences. She translated our day into codes and statutes, into diagrams of proximity and intent. She asked me to walk the hallway in slow motion, to show where feet had been. I walked it twice. Once as memory, once as evidence. Both felt partial. She said that's normal. Normal is a word that does difficult work in expensive offices. The formal decision arrived without music. Letters, seals, signatures, the geometry of officials agreeing. Self-defense. Necessary force. It read like a dictionary pretending to be merciful. The words were correct and still couldn't carry the room. We remained in the room with the weight those words couldn't lift. Neighbors came with food because that's what decent people do when the English language runs out of helpful shapes. Casseroles are a syntax you can eat. Someone left flowers whose smell argued with the disinfectant and won. People hugged us in the hallway, careful not to step on our story. They said, "If you need anything," which is both sentence and blanket. We said, "Thank you," which is both gratitude and triage. Media moved on. They always do. The tape came down. The watch went back to Dad's wrist, lighter than it had been, as if time had skimmed some of itself off in payment. The knife returned to the drawer after a long discussion we had without moving our mouths. Could it be just a knife again? Objects are innocent until asked to stand too close to a narrative. We made a new place for it, in the back, not as a shame but as a pause. There were practicalities, insurance and locksmiths, and the dull courage of forms. The locksmith replaced the front door lock and left 3 new keys on a ring that chimed like a small, bright future. Dad labeled each one with his tidy handwriting. Handwriting is a ceremony. It says, "This is the name of what opens." At night, the apartment practiced quiet. The dishwasher sounded like someone thinking. The windows learned to make peace with their frames again. I tried to sleep without testing the hallway for ghosts that were never supernatural. When I did sleep, it was because exhaustion bullied me into it. When I woke, I did the inventory you do when you don't trust your life to stay put. Hands, breath, light, names. I picked up the letter one more time and read the last line again, as if repetition could change its tense. It didn't. Still, it taught me a grammar I would use later. That some warnings are only audible in retrospect, but boundaries can be spoken forward. The city didn't change for us. Buses kept time. School bells rang. The bakery forgot to charge for a second roll, then remembered and laughed. The extraordinary is mostly a lens. The ordinary goes stubbornly on. We cleaned the kitchen thoroughly. The way you clean a rental car before return, even if it was already fine. Mom moved her lesson plans back to the usual shelf. Dad set his watch on the dresser that night, and it made the softest, bravest sound a watch can make. Continued. I stood in the doorway and memorized a new truth. We had survived the night the house stopped pretending. Survival isn't victory, it's permission to keep going. The quiet after headlines is not silence, it's heavy weather. It presses on the lungs first. Our apartment learned a new kind of hush that sounded like someone walking softly on a memory. We moved through rooms like guests at our own table. The kettle kept its job, click, hiss, small mercy, and cups became hand warmers more than thirst answers. When people say back to normal, I think they mean back to chores. We tried that. Chores held us through the hours, but not the minutes between. Sleep arrived like a late bus, unpredictable, apologetic. I started waking at 3:11 a.m. with a certainty that felt like math. I would listen for the refrigerator's hum, the building's pipes clearing their throats, Romeo's gentle rearranging of himself on the sofa's back. I counted seconds between ticks of Dad's watch from the dresser, a metronome for a song I didn't know how to sing. In the dark, I rehearsed sentences I wished I'd said earlier, and new ones I didn't know where to put. Dad went very quiet in a way that isn't rest. He polished the watch face with his shirt hem as if clarity could be rubbed onto time. He lined up the mail into soldierly stacks and never opened a letter without placing his palm flat on the envelope first, as if introducing himself to whatever might be inside. He checked the windows twice, then once more, and pretended he'd only done it once. When I asked if he wanted tea, he said, "In a minute," like time and he could negotiate. Mom organized. That's what her hands do when her heart is working out a problem. She filed recipes, updated the emergency contacts on the fridge, put spare light bulbs in a labeled tin. Her smile got efficient. It closed the emotional distance the way you shut a window before a storm. At night, she sat with me at the table and we played a quiet game, truth in small doses. One fact each, then we'd switch to weather. It was a kind of kindness we could afford. Neighbors tried to stitch the edges of our days. Senora Julia knocked with caldo, and an opinion about healing that involved cinnamon tea and long walks. She left movie tickets on the doormat with a note. Laugh at least twice. The couple upstairs invited us for Sunday dinner and told a story so ridiculous, couch, dog, exploding soda, that it made our laughter sound like it had been living under the furniture waiting for its cue. For 2 hours, We were regular people who oversalt soup and argue about whether the bus driver was flirting. When we came home, the hallway felt less like a museum exhibit and more like a place where feet belonged. Church, for us, became chairs and screens. On Tuesday nights, a friend streamed an old film onto a sheet tacked to the living room wall. The picture wobbled when the fan turned, the actors' faces bending slightly with the air. We ate popcorn like a sacrament. Romeo patrolled the perimeter as if cinema were a security risk. The movies didn't fix anything, but they gave the evenings a spine. One afternoon, Dad didn't come home on time. Late isn't unusual for a man with a badge, but the hour stretched until the apartment got narrow. I called, and when he answered, his voice had the flattened tone of someone on a ledge bargaining with gravity. I didn't ask where he was. I said, "We're having caldo. It's better hot." After a long breath, he said, "On my way," and the line cleared enough to let me stand up again. That night, Mom left her hand on his sleeve while we watched a sitcom where nothing serious ever happens. We laughed too hard at something barely funny. Relief is noisy. We booked therapy like you book a plumber when the sink finally stops pretending. The waiting room was beige and brave, with chairs that forgave posture and a plant that looked real enough to encourage honesty. The therapist asked good, annoying questions. He respected nouns. He let pauses count as answers. He said the word trauma without italics or a whisper, and it turned out the word could sit in the room without burning it down. Dad told the hallway story in short pieces, like carrying groceries, 2 bags at a time. Mom told the house story, the long one that starts with oranges and ends with paperwork, and her voice learned how to put commas in the right places again. I learned to say "I feel" without an apology stapled to the end. Grief has a flavor, metallic at first, then chalky, then something like rain if you could eat it. We learned to change that taste with rituals. Morning tea. Evening walks around the block to count the lit windows. A weekly phone call with an aunt who told me family history in tiny installments like vitamins. I kept a small notebook where I wrote down one thing each day that didn't lie: the weight of a mug, the bus arriving when it said it would, Romeo choosing my lap when there were warmer options. We let the apartment help. We moved the bed away from the door because doors had learned a new language. We placed Dad's watch on a dish at night so its sound would be more deliberate, less everywhere. The kitchen knife went into the back of the drawer, reachable, not visible, because objects can retire from stories and still be useful. We bought a kettle that whistles. The first time it sang, we both jumped and then laughed, which is a pretty good outcome for a kettle. Friends brought us outside gently. 10 minutes in the park, one said. No heroics. The grass was ordinary, which felt like mercy. A kid learning to ride a bike fell in slow motion, then stood up delighted with himself for the landing. A dog insisted a fountain was a dragon. The sky managed its business without referencing hours. On the way home, Dad didn't look at his watch until the stairs. Some nights were worse. The hallway ran a reel we didn't buy tickets for. I'd step into the bathroom and suddenly forget why I'd gone in. My hands would find the sink and hold it like the edge of a boat. On those nights, Mom made hot milk and put a drop of vanilla in it because olfactory memory can be re-authored. She sat across from me while I drank. We didn't call it healing. We called it tonight. On a Wednesday that felt like a month, Dad agreed to a support group he'd been avoiding. He came home with a brochure folded into quarters and a face that had learned a new adjective: unalone. Men talked, he said, the way you report a rare weather event. After that, his silence changed temperature. It grew less sharp, more thoughtful, like a room where someone opened a window and then remembered to close it before bedtime. The net widened. Teachers who bent deadlines without making a show of kindness. The corner grocer who slipped an extra orange into the bag as if bribing the future. A neighbor kid who asked if Romeo could be borrowed for a science project about naps. We said yes to small invitations and no to anything that required pretending. Boundaries started to sound like hospitality for ourselves. The city went on. Buses, bells, bakery. The world doesn't pause for your private earthquakes. It expects you to learn to walk during aftershocks. We practiced. Our steps were not elegant, but we made it to the couch, the table, the door, and back again. On Sundays, we peeled oranges, the rind falling in one long coil if we were careful. When the coil kept its shape, we took it as a sign that hands can remember gentleness even after they've had to be strong. One evening, after a day that wasn't notable, we watched the kind of movie that ends where it began. Same porch light, same joke landing twice. Mom put her head on my shoulder for the first time since the night of the click. Dad set his watch on the coffee table, face down, which he never did, and closed his eyes. The room didn't rush to fill the quiet. It let us have it. That's when I understood a different definition of recovery. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of room. Recovery didn't arrive with a trumpet. It sounded like a calendar reminder that refuses to give up. Therapy at 4 o'clock, groceries at 5:15, call Aunt Marta at 7. I treated the schedule like a brace for a healing bone, something you wear until the limb remembers its shape. On Mondays, I walked the long way to school, not for fitness, but to prove to the sidewalk that I was still its person. On Tuesdays, I learned to breathe on purpose, 4 in, 6 out, like talking kindly to a skittish animal. On Wednesdays, I wrote letters to myself I never mailed. Thursdays became laundry and logic. Fold, sort, decide. Fridays, I allowed for mess. Therapy swapped from triage to training. We learned vocabulary. I wish middle school had taught. Hypervigilance, the ceiling fan you keep monitoring. Grounding, touch the table, name 5 things. Window of tolerance, how big a room your nervous system has today. The therapist called boundaries love with edges, which made them less like fences and more like frames that hold pictures up. I practiced sentences out loud until they didn't squeak. I'm not comfortable with that. Let's pause here. No for now. The words felt like learning to write with my non-dominant hand. Awkward, important, progressively legible. School turned from distraction into application. I leaned toward psychology because it felt like someone had built a flashlight for rooms like ours. I learned about signals and stories, how the brain files fear, and how you can refile it with care. I stopped romanticizing silence as strength. I stopped dragging myself for not having acted sooner. Guilt is a con artist. It counterfeits responsibility and tries to spend it in your name. I wrote that on a sticky note and taped it inside my notebook where I could find it when exams or memories tried to merge. At home, we ran experiments in gentleness. We put a small basket by the front door labeled keys, because a hook can feel like a command, and a basket feels like an invitation. We lowered the radio at night and bought a lamp with a dimmer because light should have as many settings as feelings do. We learned that a tidy kitchen helps us think, but not if the tidiness becomes a religion. When I washed dishes, I stopped aiming for silence. Clean plates can clink. The world can make small, safe noises. Dad kept going to group. He came home with other men's sentences in his pockets, lines about fear that didn't bravado themselves into lies. It's not that I'm weak, one man had said. It's that strong isn't a useful shape for every day. Dad tried the sentence on, and it fit. His watch migrated back to his wrist regularly. A citizen again, not a sentinel. He taught me to change the batteries in the smoke detector, and then admitted he'd been putting it off because ladders felt like wrong angles. We laughed in the hallway with the step stool between us like a tame animal. Mom's classroom voice returned, first in small bursts, then in warm paragraphs. She moved the lesson plans down to their usual shelf and let Romeo claim the higher one. She planted herbs on the sill, basil, mint, a bossy little rosemary that believed in itself. The kitchen started to smell like both dinner and a plan. Some nights, we cooked slowly, talking between steps like the recipe included conversation. Other nights, we surrendered to eggs and toast, which is its own kind of competence. I made new friends cautiously, as if people were thrift store sweaters you try on to see if the seam holds. A girl in literature class liked the same underlines I did. A boy in science knew when to leave a silence unfixed. We studied together at the library, chairs pulled so close the table became our third friend. They didn't ask about the hallway. They asked about the exam and my cat. We built trust with snacks and shared pencils, and the steady miracle of showing up when we said we would. Boundaries began to feel like muscle memory instead of choreography. I said no to a party that sounded like a test disguised as fun. I said yes to a volunteer shift at the community center where little kids crashed into each other like happy particles. One girl followed me for an hour, narrating her life in present tense, which is how children do theology. I learned that being useful to a small person is a painkiller you don't build a tolerance to. Love did not rush me. It appeared like a friendly bus you've seen all year and only now consider boarding. He had steady hands and a laugh that arrived on time. We didn't talk about history at first. We earned daylight together by choosing unremarkable afternoons, walks, cheap sandwiches, movies that try nothing complicated. He learned the garden's moods and Romeo's boundaries and my dislike for surprises. When he finally asked about the night, he didn't make it a quiz. He asked what I wanted him to know so he could be careful with it. Careful is underrated. I let him hold a piece of the story, not to test him, but to make the load honest. I wrote to my future self more often. Small dispatches from a life that was learning to be livable. You peeled an orange in one long coil today. You asked for a window seat and didn't apologize. You cried on the bus and nobody died. The letters were proof of motion. They were also breadcrumbs for the days when the forest looked familiar again. The house and I made a treaty. I agreed to stop interrogating it for secrets it no longer held. It agreed to forgive me for sometimes needing all the lights on. We framed new photos and placed them where old stories had stood too long. Kitchen wall, hallway eye level, the spot over the dresser where the watch had once auditioned as a siren. In one picture, Dad's smile is smaller but truer. In another, Mom's hand is on my shoulder, not protective, just present. I'm in all of them, not hiding behind anyone. We kept the letter, not as a relic, not as a wound. In a folder with other paperwork, it lives among birth certificates and warranties, things that prove existence and promise repair. Sometimes I take it out and read the last line. It still means more before than after. But after has its own grammar now. We learned. We changed. We kept going. One night, months later, the power flickered and went out. The hall gulped into darkness, and the old reel tried to start. My body twitched toward panic, and then remembered its training. 4 in, 6 out, touch the wall, name 5 things. Dad fetched the flashlight without theatrics. Mom lit a candle that made the kitchen smell like vanilla and chalkboard. We sat at the table and played 20 questions by candlelight until the building sighed itself back into electricity. When the lights returned, no one flinched. We laughed at ourselves, mildly embarrassed by our competence. I washed the candle jar in the sink and put it on the shelf beside the herbs. That's when it occurred to me. Active rebuild isn't a single moment when the music swells. It's a shelf full of small, clean jars you know exactly where to find. Later, in bed, I wrote a letter to the girl I had been. I told her that kindness with edges is still kindness. That speaking early isn't a betrayal. It's stewardship. That silence can be sacred, or it can be a trap. And the difference is whether you can leave. I told her she did enough with what she knew. I told her she'd learn more. I keep returning to the paradox that raised me. We thought silence kept us safe. It kept us exposed. Back then I believed peace was the absence of noise. Now I think peace is the presence of room. Room for a sentence to stand up. for a boundary to take a breath, for a person to say no without becoming the villain of the evening. That's the meaning I brought out of our hallway. Kindness without edges leaks. Kindness with edges holds. The objects still teach. The doorframe says, "You're allowed to take up space." The watch says, "Take time before time takes you." The kettle says, "Small heat can be handled. It whistles when it needs attention." The letter says, "Read the last line now, not later." None of these are metaphors when you live inside them long enough. They're instructions disguised as furniture. So here is the tool I promised way back at the start, the one I wish someone had handed me at 14. It's small enough to memorize and strong enough to keep you company at a kitchen table, on a bus, in a room that's learned a new language. I'm not comfortable with this. I need the door open. If that can't happen, I'm stepping away. Change the nouns to match your life. Music too loud, joke not okay, hug I didn't ask for, schedule that eats my sleep. If you need a gentler entry, start with, "I want this to work, and for that I need." If someone tries to argue, don't litigate your feelings. Repeat the line like you're protecting oxygen. Boundaries aren't negotiations, they're physics. Recovery didn't make me fearless, it made me fluent. I learned to say no without a 2-paragraph apology and yes without a secret resentment. I learned that early honesty is a form of care, sometimes tender, sometimes firm, never decorative. When I failed forward. I spoke late rather than never. I stepped back rather than freeze in place. I asked for a pause instead of pretending calm with my hands under the table. If you're listening with your own room in mind, consider a ritual to anchor the week. Ours is embarrassingly simple and stubbornly effective. Ritual of the Coil. Peel 1 orange on Sundays. Try for a single long rind. If it breaks, laugh and keep peeling. While you peel, name 1 boundary you'll keep this week and 1 kindness you'll offer yourself on purpose. Put the rind in a bowl by the sink. The house will smell like a decision for a few hours. Doorframe check. Before difficult conversations, stand in a doorway and place your palm on the wood. Say your sentence out loud once. Doors are for entering and leaving. They understand both kinds of courage. Watch reset. Once a day, place your phone face down and set a timer for 3 quiet minutes. Listen for small things that won't make the news. Kettle hiss, street bus, your own breath learning its length. Peace is not a headline, it's a practice. If you have children, teach them the sentence early and casually, the way you teach a kid to look both ways. If you have aging parents, offer the sentence as a gift they're allowed to open whenever they're tired of pretending. If you are the person who usually swallows discomfort so the room stays pretty, write the sentence on a sticky note and hide it behind your favorite mug until you know it by heart. What about regret? I carry mine like a polished stone, real, small enough to hold, smooth from being turned over. Regret teaches not to rewrite my past, but to edit my future in real time. When I hear myself say later, I ask whether I mean never. When I tell myself it's not a big deal, I check if what I really mean is I don't want to make it bigger by naming it. Naming is not escalation. It's navigation. Sometimes people ask whether our kitchen is happy now. Happy is too flimsy a word for rooms that have done this kind of work. The kitchen is honest now. The watch ticks without performing. The knife slices fruit and returns to its drawer. The letter lives among documents we keep because life demands proof of both origin and repair. Romeo supervises as if promoted. We still have ordinary arguments about salt and bedtime and who forgot to water the basil. Ordinary arguments are a luxury. If your life right now feels like the 30 seconds before the click, I'm not going to hand you slogans. I'm going to hand you sentences and small practices because that's how we stayed. Use mine if you want them, or write your own. Boundary. I care about this, and for it to work, I need. Exit. I'm stepping out now. We can try again when it's calm. Re-entry. I'm ready to continue if we keep the door open and the volume down. Wherever you are, bus, bed, kitchen sink, tell me the line you're going to practice this week. Tell me the ritual you'll try once, not someday. Pick a time, set the watch, peel the orange. Let the room learn your voice. Let your body learn that you can leave and come back and still belong. I was 14 when I pressed an envelope shut and called it peace. I'm 73 now, and peace looks like a door that opens, a watch that's set, a voice that arrives on time. If you need to borrow mine until yours warms up, take it. I'm not comfortable with this. I need the door open. If that can't happen, I'm stepping away. Say it twice. The second time will sound like you.